Welcome everybody to my session. I will talk about how we enable SAP ERP systems to stream events and data across your enterprise in real time. I'm Ricardo Gomez-Omke and I work for Solace as a VP of Business Development and SAP Integration. Let me start by setting the scene. What we see here is sort of feedback, what we've gathered over the time from our customer interactions, and what they're all saying to us is that they're trying to become more real-time and more instantaneous and enable continuous processing within their enterprise. At the same time, their customers and partners require and aspire to do business in a different way, so more subscription-based, which also means that the interactions are much more continuous. Notifications get sent out continuously about the business processes and the progress of the business processes. But at the same time, there are challenges in this transformation. And one of the biggest challenges is that the business is much more distributed today, in the sense that our IT landscape used to sit in a central data center and we had everything under one roof and under control. But today, in particular with organizations that are global, we see a much more distributed IT deployment. So that might be an on-premise data center, multiple on-premise data centers when you are more distributed, and of course, public clouds. So we're getting into a very highly distributed hybrid environment that needs to be interconnected and events and data be sent across those. And last but not least, the actual amount of data that people want to send around, it's growing constantly. When we look at sort of the IoT landscape, where we have our assets equipped with sensors, control systems, robots, vehicles, in terms of the connected car space, for example, all of these things now produce data as well. And of course, they are inherently distributed. So what does that have to do with SAP? We have started about 15 years ago looking at this highly distributed event-driven architectures in the financial space. So we started with market data. The major investment banks actually want to distribute data from exchanges to their trading floors and capture orders, and everything must be in real time. And of course, it's inherently very distributed. And then about 6-7 years ago, we saw exactly the same pattern being repeated in the IoT space, where connected assets and the sensors, they send telemetry data around the world and across our enterprise. And over the last 2 years, we have now actually seen the same change occurring when we're talking about our SAP systems. So of course, SAP typically runs your enterprise. It's sort of the lifeblood of your enterprise, of your business processes that you serve your customers and partners with. But the requirement now becomes that we actually start integrating that data that originates from SAP in real time across our enterprise. And we want to also combine it with data that comes from other sources. For example, a very common use case is to combine IoT data, for example, in the supply chain area, with your SAP data where you actually plan all your logistics and supply chain processes. And here are a couple of example projects, and let me go through them very briefly. So we have, on one hand, a manufacturing company, consumer packaged goods company, and the challenge that they had and what they needed a solution for was the central planning of recipes and ingredients happens in an SAP system. The manufacturing sites are distributed, not only within one country, but across multiple countries, and in one case, actually across the continent. So that meant that what they tried to achieve is distribute those ingredients and recipe changes in real time down to the factory floor as soon as possible. Second use case, more in the HR department, very simple, but actually from a technical point of view, quite challenging, where our HR data is mastered within an SAP system. Employees being onboarded and coming to work for that company, they now need to be enabled to get into through security systems, door lock systems need to be updated, and so on. And all of that needs to be happening in real time. Another very interesting case is in the connected asset space, where you have, in this case, elevators and escalators that are all equipped with sensors and constantly stream updates about the operation. So, which floor they're on, are the elevators actually functioning correctly, and so on. And all of that data, since it comes from up to 2 million assets that are distributed all around the world, all the data needs to be streamed into a central analytics platform. That analytics platform then decides whether an asset needs maintenance or not. The maintenance, however, is then again scheduled and organized within an SAP system. So now we have the situation where we want data coming from potentially 2 million assets across the world being analyzed in real time and work orders being created within an SAP system. So that is an example of how SAP and IoT data needs to be combined in order to drive efficiencies and in essence, reduce truck rolls. That's what the real business case was about. And if we sort of look at the very typical use cases that we see, it starts with, every customer we talk about, starts with, can you please take our SAP data and hydrate a data lake or multiple data lakes with that SAP data for analysis, for reporting, and so on. So that's a very, very typical integration use case. The next one is sort of what we call the master data distribution, again, from inventory to products to HR information. That master data needs to be distributed into other platforms and sites that are potentially not SAP modules. And we see those types of use cases across different industries. Later on, I'm going to give you an example in retail, but we also see it in manufacturing and in supply chain. So all of these industries, they have very specific events that happen that need to be distributed in real time in order to maximize efficiency and reduce costs. So how do we do that? Here's a very good example of an architecture where we see in the middle sort of the green circles representing the Solace message brokers, and the lines between them then make up what we call the Solace hybrid event mesh. So that is the foundation of distributing events from all sorts of different environments. In this case, we can see here a public cloud in Azure, in Google, in AWS, where we actually have the SAP Cloud Platform running, and of course, our traditional on-premise systems. So by deploying this event mesh, we now have the facility to distribute these events in real time. And how do we get in and out of the SAP ECC system? And that is, if you can see on the slide there, our, the red boxes where it says ACI, that's the Asapio Cloud Integrator. It's an add-on that we install onto the SAP ECC server. We configure that to either send events out into the event mesh or receive updates from the event mesh and apply them to the SAP system. So let's dive a little bit deeper as to how this Asapio Cloud Integrator add-on actually works. As I mentioned, it's an add-on. You install it onto the SAP system. It's fully certified, and it's secure, it's robust, and it's scalable. And what we then need to do after we've installed it, we need to configure it to say which business objects do we want to monitor for changes, which APIs will we expose to the outside world to update our business objects, which tables do we want to monitor, which tables do we want to update, and so on. So it's a configuration exercise after installation. And then once you have configured that, you can start monitoring what goes in and out. And then the operations obviously will then connect to the Solace event mesh for further distribution. And it's really as simple as these 3 steps that you see here. So you install it, you decide, for example, you want to event enable your sales orders. So you configure that event. In the Asapio Cloud Integrator, you say, I want to monitor all changes to my business object sales order. If a change is detected, what do I want to send out? So you configure the payload that you want to send out. What information about the sales order do you want to externalize as an event? You do that, and then the cloud integrator will start sending those events onto the mesh. And and there's a number of configuration options in that space. So obviously it also supports the batch mode, so you could poll for changes every 10 minutes or half hour. But in order to make it truly event driven, we recommend to run it on change pointers. It applies the normal SAP access control to those objects, and once an event is on the event mesh, the Solace event mesh provides the access control to those events. And depending on your internal policies, there's different types of events and data that people publish. So, the first one is notification only. So it could just include the business object ID and perhaps a link to retrieve the data from the SAP system. So all it does, it basically notifies this particular sales order has been changed. Or it could include also the metadata, which fields have changed, so that receiving systems can decide, this field has changed, yes, I'm interested in it, so let me get the change. Or it can indeed also include the entire data set. So not only that the sales order has changed, but actually all the fields and the values that have changed. So for example, if you want to distribute stock levels or inventory levels within your enterprise, you might just want to send the entire data set out. So there's no need for any application to actually go back to the SAP system to request the full data set. And I want to sort of finish off with a small case study. In this case here, we're looking at digital retail story. It's a French retail company, mainly with shops in Europe, but there's over 4,000 of those. And the main challenge was that the click and collect process was essentially not fully synced. So that meant that sometimes customers would go online, order a certain item for later collection in a shop. They get to the shop, and maybe that item was already out of stock. And the solution is, that this company actually has then implemented is to keep all these different retail channels, the point of sales in the different shops, the inventory system, the warehouse management system, the e-commerce system, in sync with what stock is available where. And if we look at the architecture of this installation, it looks as follows. At the top, we have our shops. So there's not only two, but obviously, up to 4,000 of those, each one's with their point of sale system. Every receipt, every sale that is made is instantly sent over the Solace event mesh into the SAP platform, so that the SAP is always in sync with what is happening in the shop floor. Does its calculations and then sends updates out to the e-commerce shop, which actually happens to run in a Google Cloud, and it's not, in this case, not an SAP system. At the same time, the exact same event stream goes into a data lake, which is running in the public cloud, in this case in Azure. And of course, the other way around, the same thing happens. Somebody orders something on the e-commerce shop, that order is sent into SAP. SAP would then send out events back out to the shops or to the relevant warehouses to reserve that item and not to sell it in the shop. So this way, the customer actually has now a fully synchronized system and a much better customer experience than before. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I hope this was interesting. My name is Ricardo Gomez-Ohnke. I work for Solace, and I'd be happy if you want to discuss a bit more.